Um, just a couple of general announcements. The first is I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Gentile to everybody. Steve, could you raise your hand? He's in the back of the room. He is the new Deputy Chair for Administration in the Department of Psychiatry. So no matter what your problems are, take them to Steve and he'll help you sort them out. No, Steve, we're thrilled to have Steve join our department. He was previously the lead administrator for the sections of cardiology and the Department of Laboratory Medicine. He really knows what he's doing, and he's really accomplished in doing it. So we are greatly enriched by his joining our department. Also, in terms of upcoming grand rounds, Ivan De Araujo from our department is going to be talking next week at grand rounds about neural circuits for hunting, feeding, and aggression, which is really interesting work linking the urge to eat and food reward to actually behaviors that get food. And this is very pioneering work from Ivan. And then the following week, which is the 20th of October, we are going to have a panel with several people contributing: Susan Boulware, Anisha Patel, Christy Olazeski, Stuart Weinzimmer. And it's going to be talking about working with transgender and gender expansive populations, how we can deliver better health care to this population. I think that would be really interesting and important, and one of the first times that we've had an opportunity as a department to talk about these issues. I would also say that last week we had our first diversity task force or group meeting, a very interesting presentation about legal aspects of diversity. These are going to be quarterly meetings and really interesting and important, and you know, there'll be opportunities to participate in the future. And I would also say that we've instituted as a medical school and as a department a policy where everybody participating in search committees will obtain training in implicit recognizing and handling implicit bias to make our searches, help to make them more diverse, and so there'll be opportunities coming up to get training in implicit bias for people who are interested in the topic, but particularly for people who will be participating in searches, the recruitment of new faculty members. With that, it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce our friend and colleague, Joel Galerner, who will introduce our friend and colleague, Murray Steen, one of the real innovators and pioneers in PTSD research. Joel.
So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, as John said, Murray Steen. This is going to be a very brief and abridged introduction because I could easily fill most of the time. He's Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Family Medicine and Public Health, Vice Chair for Clinical Research in Psychiatry at University of California, San Diego. He was graduated from University of Manitoba, completed his residency and fellowship at University of Toronto and National Institute of Mental Health in Tom Udy's group, where I met him in the late 1980s. And he has an MPH from Johns Hopkins. He's co-PI of the Army STARS project, co-PI of DoD-funded multi-site trial of losartan for PTSD, co-principal proponent with myself of VA cooperative study, genome-wide association study of post-traumatic stress disorder in the Million Vets program. He has numerous SAB and editorial leadership positions. He is a well-recognized world authority on epidemiology, treatment, and genetics of PTSD and other anxiety disorders. If each of his publications were an electoral college vote, he would be elected president unanimously and have over 60 votes to spare to give to someone else. But he's Canadian. I'm really happy to have worked with him for over 30 years and looking forward to his talk on traumatic mind injury. Murray.
Thank you, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's a little daunting to think about talking about anything related to PTSD when at Yale or West Haven. You know, sort of like bringing coals to Newcastle or IEDs to Afghanistan. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about a disorder that doesn't actually exist, traumatic mind injury. Just to start out by saying this is not an attempt to try and create a new disorder for DSM-6. I'm not lobbying for that. But hopefully as we get into this, you'll kind of see where I'm going with this. So here's my disclosure. And I'll start off by saying I'm not going to even try to thank all the people who are involved with the work that I'm going to talk about, several of whom are in this room. But all that I'm talking about involves the work of many people across many institutions over a long period of time. So what do I want to do in the next 45, 50 minutes? So I want to briefly provide an overview on the clinical epidemiology of PTSD and also kind of tie that in with the syndromes that you can see following traumatic injury, traumatic physical injury. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time delineating the similarities and differences between the kind of injury we think you get after you've had an emotional injury, post-traumatic stress-related kinds of things, and the kinds of symptoms and problems you may develop after you've had a traumatic injury to your head, to your brain, post-concussive symptoms. And then start to get us thinking about the biological bases on which there may be shared symptoms and possibly also common risk factors. And then talk about how that convergence may want to have us thinking about that these may not necessarily in all cases be discrete disorders. You know, one that you get from emotional injury and the other you get from a concussive injury, that there may be shared pathophysiology and it may be beneficial to us from a research and clinical perspective to think along those lines. So anytime, and I'm going to be showing you a lot of data that come from military studies, and what I've learned in doing this now for about 7 or 8 years, when I first started joining phone calls and research meetings that had to do with the military, I have never heard so many abbreviations in my whole life. And so these are some of them. I think this audience is probably familiar with most or all of them. I remember for months when we would have Army Stars phone calls with the ODUSA that I didn't want to admit that I didn't even know who the heck I was talking to. The ODUSA turns out to be the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army. And I eventually just had to say, who are we, who is this phone call with? So lots of abbreviations. Army, military loves abbreviations. So you all know the DSM-5 criteria for PTSD. And essentially, the important thing to remember is that we think about PTSD as being a disorder that develops in some individuals. And of course, you want to, and we are thinking about, you know, why does it develop in some individuals and not others? Some of it has to do with the nature of the trauma, but a lot of it has to do with the nature of the individual and their risk factors, some of which may be genetic So PTSD is this disorder that is fairly unique in DSM. So, you know, in psychiatry, we think about virtually all of the disorders we have, we think about as having both a psychosocial basis and a genetic basis, biological basis, but very few of the diagnostic criteria say anything about things that happen to people in order for a disorder to develop. So, you know, if we're talking about major depression, I don't think there's anybody here who would say that what happens in people's lives and the stresses they experience don't have something to do with when people become depressed and when they're not depressed, but those aren't part of the diagnostic criteria. PTSD very clearly says that this is what can happen after this really bad stuff happens. And what we're talking about, of course, are events that involve actual or threatened death, serious injury. DSM-5 has explicitly added sexual violation, and then, you know, there's different ways you can experience it, and I won't go into that. So, is this a criterion A event, which would be the kind of trauma that could give you PTSD? I guess if you're a chicken, it could. The point here is that as much as we try to define objectively, you know, what kind of events need to happen in order for you to possibly get PTSD, it's very hard to do. So much of it is contextual. And, you know, what's life-threatening to one person, what's life-threatening to me is very likely not life-threatening to somebody who's a trained soldier. You know, a gunshot, a bomb going off, most trained soldiers, they don't think of that as being life-threatening necessarily. They have a whole different cognitive framework around things. You know, that's going to scare the hell out of me. So context becomes extremely important when we think about PTSD. These are the PTSD symptoms. Of course, from DSM-4 to 5, we've kind of added this domain of negative cognitions and mood, which in some ways I think is an attempt to incorporate kind of the depressive, the mood symptoms that we frequently see among people with PTSD and kind of say, well, they're so common, maybe that's actually part of the disorder. Unclear, you know, how much of a difference it makes if we conceptualize PTSD as including that or being a frequent comorbid condition. In reality, as you all know, it's even more complex than that. So sure, we have re-experiencing and dysphoria and hyperarousal. And we have these two kinds of avoidance, active avoidance and emotional avoidance or numbing. We have anger as being a prominent problem for many of the patients that we try to treat. And then guilt, depending on the kinds of trauma that people have experienced and again, the context. Guilt can be a huge problem that's usually not addressed by most of the treatments we have, even some of our evidence-based psychological treatments, although now there's been attempts to try and bring that in as well. But it's a really complicated sort of story, and it's like a lot of the problems we deal with, mental health problems. They're extremely complex. We do our best to try and describe a prototype for PTSD, but everybody's a little different, and that makes it difficult for us to hone in on a common neurobiology and to find treatments that work for everybody. How common is PTSD? So the data from the US general population suggests it's pretty common. 3 or 4% of people in the National Comorbidity Survey. Lifetime, it's even more common. Like most of the mental disorders, or at least anxiety and depressive disorders, women seem to be, it's more prevalent among women, and women also seem to be at higher risk. I'll talk about that a little bit. Anytime somebody shows you data having to do with epidemiology of something, you know, you always want to say, well, you know, who does that apply to? There's no common experience of people in the United States. We have many subcultures and all sorts of different experiences. So even within the US, PTSD rates are 2 to 3 times higher in American Indians living on reservations, so their rates of PTSD are somewhere around 10%. PTSD actually is the most prevalent mental disorder among women living, American Indians living on reservations, where about 1 in 5 have PTSD according to surveys. I live in San Diego, and up the road from us in Orange County is a very large Cambodian population. And many of the folks who moved there were Cambodian refugees from the Khmer Rouge regime. And this study, which is now about 10 years old, was 20 years later. So most of the folks had moved to Orange County, been in the US for 20 years. They did a survey of the prevalence of PTSD in that community, not in mental health settings, but among the community in general. At that time, 62% of the people living in the community had PTSD. So, you know, very different experiences, even among people in the US, so that this 3.5% really doesn't tell the whole story. Another subpopulation within the US are active duty military and subsequently veterans. And again, this is a subgroup of the US population that has had a very different experience, a set of experiences than most of us. These data now are about 7 years old, and they were a couple years into the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, looking at the rates of post-deployment mental health problems in the US Army. And just important to kind of, not so important that we distinguish guard and active duty, but overall, so these were assessments that are done routinely, surveillance assessments done routinely by the Army when soldiers come back from deployment. They still do this now. The nature of it's changed a little bit. Somewhere around 15% of soldiers returning from a deployment had major depression. Somewhere around 15% had PTSD. So very, very common problems, far higher than in the general population. And a recent study took a look at the burden of mental illness on the US Armed Forces. This is in 2014. And what they've plotted are medical encounters, number of individuals affected, hospital bed days, and lost time from work. And they pretty much scale with each other. The most common cause of this burden on their health comes from injuries, some poisonings, but it's mostly injuries. Number 2 is mental disorders. So, you know, we're sending people to war, they're getting shot at, they're getting blown up, they're exposed to all sorts of diseases, and yet mental disorders is, you know, number 2 and very close to number 1 in terms of the impact on medical encounters, the number of individuals affected. So a tremendous burden of mental illness on our armed forces. Skip that. So particularly, you know, those of us who work in VA settings, and, you know, at one point, the thinking was that PTSD was something that veterans got early on, you know, Vietnam veterans. Nobody else had PTSD. I trained in Canada. There was no such thing as PTSD because we didn't have Vietnam veterans. That, of course, was not true, but that's the way it was viewed. And we now know that even though a lot of PTSD is related to military exposure, in the grand scheme of things, it's only a very small subset of the US population who fights, who's involved in the military. So what are other sources of PTSD in the general population? So criminal victimization, bad things that happen to people, particularly bad things that happen to women, things like rape and intimate partner violence. Rape and intimate partner violence, particularly intimate partner violence, is usually not a single event. The whole notion of PTSD originally evolved with the idea that one really bad traumatic event would happen and the person could be changed as a result. But when you think about things like intimate partner violence, this goes on for months and years, and there's repeated trauma. And so it's a whole different notion that we now have about PTSD. It can be caused by a single trauma, but most PTSD that we encounter in the general population is caused by repeated trauma Other things that cause PTSD are motor vehicle accidents, childhood abuse, sort of a whole other discussion, and then things that happen more randomly, like natural disasters, and of course we've talked about terrorism and we've talked about war. So bad things can happen to people, really bad things, life-threatening things. And of course, the context of what's life-threatening, as I talked about, depends on the individual's prior experience. But there are also these individual risk factors that seem to influence whether or not someone's likely to develop PTSD. So yes, you could probably take 100 people and think of the most traumatic things you could do to them, and you'd probably get the vast majority of them to develop PTSD. Rape trauma is like that. Very, very, 70% of women will have PTSD symptoms, at least after rape. But for most kinds of traumas, motor vehicle collisions, fighting in war, there are these individual risk factors that seem to result in variation of who develops problems and who doesn't. Now, these are risk factors for the development of PTSD after traumatic physical injury. So somebody who is in a car accident and breaks a leg is an example. Women are at greater risk than men. The extent of physical injury makes a difference. So if you broke a leg and an arm, on average, your risk is higher than if you had a single location injury. The extent to which you experience ongoing pain after the injury predicts certainly persistence of PTSD, failure to recover. This is a risk factor that's found in virtually every study of PTSD in every context, not just after traumatic injury. Lower education or IQ is a risk factor. If your physical injury resulted in an ICU stay, your risk is higher of developing PTSD. Part of that probably is a reflection of if you had an ICU stay, it was a more severe injury, so it scales with that. But it also has to do with the kinds of things we do to people iatrogenically when they're in ICUs. And some of that can actually result in PTSD symptoms. And a big factor that's come up in a lot of studies is the presence or absence of a traumatic brain injury. So if the physical injury involved injury to bodily parts other than the head or the brain, the risk is lower than if a traumatic brain injury was also involved. So let's sort of get into that a little bit. So first of all, definitionally, mild traumatic brain injury is synonymous with concussion. We're talking about the same thing. Mild traumatic brain injury is the event, really, that we often sort of talk about. Somebody has PTSD, which of course is a consequence of an emotional trauma, and we'll go, somebody has mild TBI. Well, no, the TBI was the injury itself, and they may have persistent post-concussive symptoms as a result. It turns out that there's been an increase in visits to emergency rooms in the United States for traumatic brain injury. Probably not because there's more traumatic brain injury. In fact, people are wearing more helmets when they're bicycling and doing things to protect themselves. This really probably reflects awareness and a change in the thinking about TBI. It used to be that in my area, playing sports, played hockey, if you smashed your head and you were on the ice for a little while and dazed, you'd kind of get up, sit on the bench, and then go back out on the next shift. Might not remember the rest of the game, but that was the way things were done. And now with this recognition that even so-called mild concussions may have long-term repercussions, things are changing. So people are showing up in the ED much more than they used to. There are these rough definitions for severity of TBI. The TBI field is really reassessing these. The whole idea that a mild TBI, which is a concussion, is mild is not true. So again, the mild TBI kind of refers to the acute nature of the injury. And so if the concussion was associated with a loss of consciousness or an alteration of consciousness, which can be definitionally tricky. For, you know, under 30 minutes, that's still mild. Post-traumatic amnesia for less than 24 hours is still mild. That's not so mild, right? If you get knocked out and you're out for 29 minutes and you don't remember what happened for an entire day, that's still considered mild. So there's a lot of variability within the mild that the field is struggling with and trying to come up with better definitions that have more prognostic impact. What do we know about long-term effects of TBI? So there's been a lot of work in the past 5-6 years with the notion that although most people recover from a concussion, and most people recover very quickly without sequelae, most people recover somewhere around a week, there's still this small subgroup of people that wind up having persistent symptoms. What kind of symptoms? Headache, concentration problems, dizziness, sometimes tinnitus. And there's very little understood, although I'll show you some data, about who recovers and who doesn't and what the determinants of that are. Part of it has to do with the variability in this, you know, if you're knocked out for a minute versus you're knocked out for 29 minutes. Surprisingly, that has relatively little impact on long-term sequelae. So other things do seem to be important. So if you develop a mental disorder, depression, PTSD, after your TBI, you're much less likely to recover in terms of these other symptoms like headache and concentration problems and dizziness. There's a lot of interest now also in looking at biomarkers like plasma tau to predict very early on, sort of in the ED or even on the playing field, whether or not you've had an injury that is not likely to recover spontaneously. And of course, there's a lot of interest and still a lot of controversy around the notion that even repeated mild injuries, repeated concussions, can yield this chronic traumatic encephalopathy that has been diagnosed post-mortem in many boxers, many NFL football players, and still a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding why some people develop that and others don't. So when we think about PTSD, we're always thinking about this cluster of symptoms that often go hand in hand. So as you all know, a lot of people with PTSD have depression, a lot of people develop substance use problems, a lot have chronic pain, a lot develop substance use problems with their opioids as a result of their chronic pain, and a lot will have chronic symptoms related to TBI as well. And a while ago now, Tom McAllister and I took a look at the definitions for post-traumatic stress and for persistent post-concussive symptoms. And this was at a time when, psychiatrists and psychologists focused on PTSD, and neurologists and neuropsychologists focused on TBI and post-concussive symptoms. And there were very few people who were kind of talking to each other. And the patients, so when you take a look actually definitionally, you can see that there's tremendous overlap between the kinds of symptoms that we think diagnostically you get after an emotional trauma, those are the PTSD symptoms, and the kind of symptoms that you get after a head trauma. So mood symptoms, irritability, insomnia, trouble concentrating, fatigue, avoidance, hyperarousal, common to both sets of disorders, and not a whole lot unique. PTSD, the re-experiencing symptoms per se, are definitionally unique, but they also do occur in people with persistent post-concussive symptoms. They're just not part of the definition. The shame and guilt that may or may not be part of PTSD, depending on the nature of the trauma. And then some symptoms that are relatively specific to post-concussive symptoms, like sensitivity to light, which is actually a pretty rare symptom. Headache, which I think many of us would argue we see plenty of headaches and other somatic symptoms in PTSD, even without TBI. The memory deficits, yes. Cognitive symptoms aren't necessarily part of the diagnosis for PTSD, but a lot of people have them. And then maybe dizziness is more unique. The point being that part of the reason that we're seeing so much comorbidity between PTSD and post-concussive symptoms is because the definitions overlap. I'm going to skip that. What are some possible mechanisms, though, for why there may be so many shared symptoms? You know, why should physical concussive blow to the head, presumably to the brain, result in many of the same symptoms that you get after a traumatic emotional event? So we could think about biological reasons for comorbidity. Perhaps both kinds of trauma really do involve injury to brain systems involved in the pathophysiology of both disorders. There are studies suggesting that there may be structural changes associated with emotional trauma among people who develop PTSD. All sorts of theories having to do with cellular and molecular changes. We'll talk a little bit about them. And then probably strongest right now are some of the neurocognitive explanations. So both of these kinds of trauma can involve an insult to the cognitive and emotional systems that maintain our normal psychological functioning. So our ability to problem solve, our ability to emotion regulate may go offline, either with a blow to the head or with a significant traumatic emotional event. And that may be part of the reason that physical TBI, concussions, may render individuals susceptible to mental health sequelae. I'll talk more about that. So I want to show you a little bit of data from a study that colleagues and I have been involved with now for about 8 or 9 years. It's Army Stars, Bob Ursano, who is at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences in Bethesda, and I are co-PIs of the study. And we looked at traumatic brain injury and risk for mental illness and suicidality among soldiers deployed to Afghanistan. Just tell you a bit about the study. So Army Stars is a big study. It has multiple components. Part of it is a historical data study where we have access to Army medical, judicial, all sorts of records for soldiers going back about 15 years and involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. We conducted a survey of soldiers when they entered basic training that we call the New Soldier Study, about 50,000 soldiers who participated in surveys, and a subset of whom gave us DNA, and almost all completed a neurocognitive assessment. We have a cross-sectional study of the Army called the All-Army Study, a more focal study of suicide attempters and informants for completed suicides. The study I'm going to tell you about here is called the pre-post deployment study. So this involved about 8,000 soldiers, about 5,500 for whom we have longitudinal perspective data. The Army worked with us and told us when a brigade combat team, which is a group of around 2,200, 2,500 soldiers, was going to be deployed to Afghanistan. And they said, and you know, this is fairly secret, so they would tell us a couple weeks before deployment and say, you've got this day basically to go in, get the surveys done, get the blood, get out, because they're preparing to deploy. The University of Michigan did all this work for us, where they literally sent in a team of survey researchers, and the Army actually drew blood for us. And we surveyed 3 brigade combat teams on average about a month before they were deployed to Afghanistan, so that's our baseline. We were able to have access to them immediately upon their redeployment to the US after what turned out to be a 6 to 7 month average deployment. So that's our first post-deployment time period. We were given access to them again 2 or 3 months later for another survey follow-up, and then 6 to 8 months after that. And we have complete data on close to 5,600 individuals. So the Army at this time was about 15% women and about 85% men, but the women are less likely to deploy and be in combat roles, so this was almost exclusively a male sample, 95% male. And there was diversity in terms of people's prior deployment experiences. So almost a half, this was going to be their first deployment. whereas for 5%, this was already going to be their 5th deployment or more. And at this time, even before the index, this upcoming deployment, 11% of the folks had PTSD, lifetime PTSD, not necessarily current. So when they came back for this first assessment, within the first couple days of their return from Afghanistan, all of these were deployed to Afghanistan, we asked them about the kinds of exposures that they might have had, different kinds of deployment stresses using some standardized measures. So we got an index of, what was it like during their deployment? How bad was it? How stressful was it? What sort of experiences did they have? And for purposes of the data I'm going to show you, we created a 0 to 15 scale where 0 meant you had a wonderful holiday in Afghanistan. Nobody basically had 0. And 15 meaning, it was horrific. Many people in your unit were killed. You yourself may have been injured, and so on. So the mean was around 4. Interquartile range was between 2 and 6. We also asked people a number of questions to do the best we can from their self-report to tell us whether or not they'd sustained a new concussion, new traumatic brain injury, during that particular deployment. And about 1 in 5 told us that, yeah, they had something that they, and from what we could tell, sounded like they had a concussion, new concussion. And so we took a look at what disorders people had 3 months after their return. So this was our second follow-up, a whole bunch of surveys that let us pull together DSM diagnoses. And what we found was that there were relatively high rates of a variety of mental disorders occurring after deployment. And this complicated Venn, one more dimension than a Venn diagram, sort of shows the overlap, and it shows the complexity. So, we often think about it's just PTSD that people get when they have this kind of combat experience and combat stressors, not just PTSD. PTSD is definitely there, but people are also depressed, and they have other anxiety symptoms, and many of them have suicidality. The question we asked here was, well, did having a concussion while they were deployed have any impact on the likelihood of developing a disorder post-deployment? The answer is yes. So if somebody was one of those 1 in 5 people who told us that they'd had a concussion, or in some cases they had more than one new concussion during that deployment, their risk for PTSD about doubled compared to people who had similar deployment stress experiences but had not sustained a TBI. So this is after adjusting for pretty much everything else we could think of adjusting for. But it wasn't just PTSD. They were also at double the risk for major depression, and double the risk for generalized anxiety disorder, and double the risk for any of them. So this was very consistent with the literature that was coming out of other studies, other military studies, and also out of other motor vehicle accident studies, that there's something about having a concussion as part of your injury that increases risk for PTSD and these other disorders. Just going to skip this. I mentioned before that there's not a whole lot known. I talked about risk factors for PTSD after a traumatic injury, but what do we know about risk factors for not recovering from your concussion, right? Most people have a concussion, they're better within a week, back at work, back doing the things they were before. 5–10% of people, not the case. They develop persistent symptoms, or they have persistent symptoms. What are risk factors? Possibility is a younger age. The literature suggests women are at greater risk than men. Severity and location of the injury certainly matters. Possibility of genetic factors, some literature not particularly well replicated, that one of the genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's, ApoE4, may be a risk factor. The literature was suggesting, and I mentioned it already, that if you developed some kind of mental health problem after your concussion, you were more likely not to recover from your concussion. But data aren't particularly good. So within our study, we took a look at this question. So we didn't have a standardized measure of post-concussive symptoms. There are such measures that are widely used in the literature, but at the time we developed the survey, this really wasn't on our radar. But it turned out by asking about a whole lot of somatic symptoms for other reasons, we actually had a pretty good survey of symptoms that are considered post-concussive. So balance problems, sensitivity to noise, light, memory problems, irritability, and so on. And respondents rated these as either occurring none of the time through all or almost all of the time. And this was the 8-item measure that we used for the study. And you could have a range of 0, meaning you had none of these symptoms, to 32, meaning you had all of them for a lot of the time. So within Army STARS, we looked at about 6,000 soldiers assessed before deployment and 2 to 3 months after their return. I mentioned that about 1 in 5 had a concussion during their index deployment. Those that had a concussion had a median score of 12 on this measure, compared to a score that was lower, but not 0, on those who said they never had a concussion. So again, you see how even the non-concussive experiences result in some of these symptoms in some people. We did see a moderate correlation between the post-concussive symptoms and the PTSD symptoms using the PCL. What were predictors? So what predicted whether or not you had persistent post-concussive symptoms in Army STARS? Being a woman, so consistent with the literature. Having a prior concussion. So I didn't show you data, but many of the soldiers, this was not their first concussion. If they'd had a prior concussion, they were at increased risk for persistent post-concussive symptoms, and that's very consistent with what's coming out in the literature now. More concussions, bad in terms of persistence. Interestingly, what their mental state was prior to deployment influenced their likelihood of recovering from a concussion, right? So if they were not necessarily meeting diagnostic criteria, but more depressed or more anxious, distressed prior to deployment, their likelihood of recovering from a concussion, if they sustain one, was less. And then the severity of the deployment stress exposure, independent of the severity of the concussion itself, also increased their likelihood of not remitting, of having persistent symptoms. So these risk factors really overlap entirely with those for post-traumatic stress symptoms, being a woman, having previous concussions, having more symptoms before you're deployed, completely overlapping set of risk factors. So spend a couple minutes talking about genes. You have to be pretty old to even get that. So I mentioned that we believe that there's a genetic risk for PTSD. There's also some suggestion that there might be genetic risk for having persistent post-concussive symptoms. The data are not strong that are out there. We have some data from Army STARS that we've not done a GWAS, well, so I won't talk about the GWAS anyways. But in terms of candidates, there's literature from our study and from others that there are actually multiple markers in the COMT gene. So in this common Valmet variant on RS4680 does this in the same direction that in some studies, older studies, suggests maybe a risk for things like depression or other anxiety syndromes, does seem to be a risk factor also for having persistent post-concussive symptoms. In terms of PTSD risk, this is kind of a summary of maybe not all, but many of the risk factors that we think of for PTSD. So environmental risk factors, having childhood maltreatment, trauma, of course, is requisite definitionally for PTSD, having a personal history of a mood or anxiety disorder, when you're traumatized increases risk, things that happened at the time of the event, if you thought you would die, increased risk, being a woman, having some evidence of autonomic hyperactivity around the time of the traumatic event, lower IQ, all increased risk. certainly duration, severity of exposure of the trauma, family history of an anxiety depressive disorder, injury, particularly if it involves TBI, and the possibility of specific genes. And of course, the other thing this slide is meant to remind us about is that there really is an arbitrary cutoff where we say somebody has PTSD if they have symptoms over the line, and they don't have PTSD if they're on this side. In reality, when you look at the distribution of PTSD symptoms after trauma, it may not be exactly normally distributed the way I've depicted here, but it's definitely not bimodal. So anytime we're thinking about risk, and particularly once we start to think about genetics, the notion that you have the disorder or you don't is the way to study it is probably wrong. Nonetheless, what we did in this first study in Army STARS was to categorize individuals as best we could as having lifetime post-traumatic stress disorder or not. And we did this in a large European sample, and the European sample did not find any genome-wide significant markers that differentiated the folks with PTSD from those who didn't. And these are all trauma-exposed controls. Within the African-American sample, which was considerably smaller, we did find evidence of this one genome-wide significant marker on chromosome 5. And interestingly, this gene that the marker's in is ANKRD55, whose function is unknown, but it has turned up prominently in association studies of a variety of autoimmune and inflammatory disorders. So this gene has been associated with rheumatoid arthritis, with Crohn's disease, with multiple sclerosis, and with type 2 diabetes. In collaboration with Renato Palamanti and in Joel's lab, we were actually able to take a look at pleiotropy within, for this marker. So just to remind people, the idea of pleiotropy is that you have a single gene that influences multiple traits, and presumably it does so through biological pathways, that it's not just influencing multiple traits because those traits are phenotypically correlated. And so using this technique called GPA to examine pleiotropy, we actually, given the fact that that gene that we saw in the African Americans came up in many autoimmune and inflammatory disorder studies, we took a look to see whether or not there was pleiotropy between PTSD and 9 immune-related disorders using publicly available data on these other disorders from other GWASs. And we did find significant evidence of pleiotropy for SNPs that influence, for markers that influence PTSD, and those that influence rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis. So these data fit, reasonably well with the idea that with the evidence in PTSD that there is an increase in autoimmune disorders among individuals with PTSD that you see over time, and may actually play into the notion that there more broadly are autoimmune or inflammatory processes that are important in understanding PTSD. So, PTSD and inflammation, what do we know about that association? There is evidence of some increased peripheral, a little less CNS inflammation in PTSD, and one of the questions is whether or not it's cause or effect. Is it caused by biological factors that are shared between PTSD and immune disorders? Does it have to do with lifestyle factors that people with PTSD may engage in, more smoking, perhaps other less healthy habits that may be associated with increased metabolic syndrome and other inflammatory states? We know that interleukin-6 is a driver of CRP, C-reactive protein levels, and that may provide a common etiology for post-traumatic stress and post-concussive symptoms. What's known about inflammation and post-concussive symptoms? So there's some theoretical evidence that inflammatory processes may be involved and may explain some of the variation as to why most people recover and some don't from their traumatic brain injury, and those who don't, there may be inflammatory brain processes involved. But there's actually been very little human data. Within Army STARS, we did have blood samples on a subset of individuals. The plasma had actually been drawn pre-deployment, so this would be trying to see whether we can predict whether or not somebody who sustained a traumatic brain injury has persistent post-concussive symptoms on the basis of having being in a higher pro-inflammatory state before their injury. And what we measured here was IL-6 using a high-sensitivity IL-6 assay. And so overall, here are the IL-6 levels prior to deployment among individuals. And then we break, we break it down into the people who have sustained a TBI and have not recovered. So these cases are the people with persistent post-concussive symptoms. And the control group is a group that also had sustained a new TBI during their deployment, but they recovered quickly and had very low levels of persistent post-concussive symptoms. The group that didn't recover prior to deployment showed evidence of being in a higher pro-inflammatory state, which we see with this higher levels and greater variation in IL-6. So, very preliminary, but suggestive of the possibility that there is some association with inflammation as a possible etiologic explanation for some of this diversity in outcome. And so that kind of gets us back to the idea of, is there something that we might want to start thinking about as being common between PTSD and post-concussive symptoms? So here's kind of how I've been thinking about it. Some types of injuries that you get with TBI are more frightening and life-threatening than others. So, for example, if you sustained your TBI as part of a bomb going off, you've got both the concussive event and the life-threatening contextual nature. Same with the severe motor vehicle condition. Those are very different than sports concussions. So with sports concussions, you do not see anywhere near the high rates of PTSD that you do among motor vehicle collisions or people who get beat up and have PTSD. So it's not just the impact on the brain, it's this, what's clearly going to be a very complex interplay between the emotional significance, context, and the brain injury. So physical injury is a major risk factor for PTSD overall, especially if it involves TBI. Is there this subset, if now we're starting to try and stratify and say not all PTSD is alike and probably not all post-concussive symptoms are alike, is there a subgroup of individuals who might have something, that I'm calling traumatic mind injury that's really essentially the same disease? And if we could identify those people, kind of stratify along these lines, could we identify a subset of person with these symptoms who might differ in symptom profiles from other types of PTSD? Might there be a common mechanism involved that could be a target for treatment? And could we actually find some predictable response to treatment in such individuals? So I'm trying to use this as a way to help us start to stratify PTSD. Not all PTSD is the same. And from that, and the goal there would be to really say, if we have this subgroup of people and we can understand the neurobiology better and we can understand risk better, could we prevent better and could we treat differently? Could our treatments be more effective? So overall, when we think about treating mental health symptoms after TBI, well, there's clearly nothing that's FDA approved for that, but people use a number of agents off-label. We, Tom McAllister, Ross Safont in Boston, and our INTRUST consortium a couple of years ago conducted we tried to conduct a multi-center trial where we took individuals who had what you loosely could think of as being traumatic mind injury. These are people who either met criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder and or they had a history of traumatic brain injury and they presented with persistent cognitive symptoms, so attentional problems, short-term memory problems. Those people were eligible for the study, and we wanted to test whether or not a drug that was being used off-label a lot for TBI and to a lesser extent for PTSD, methylphenidate, would be useful. And we wanted to compare that to a drug that also had been used off-label a fair bit for post-concussive symptoms, and of course is used for Alzheimer's, galantamine, and compare that to placebo. So we designed a 3-arm randomized controlled trial for reasons that had little to do with science and lots to do with politics. The study was stopped early. Our intent was really to enroll about 150 people. We were only able to randomize a total of 32, and we decided we might as well look at the data and see what we've got. So what we've got is a total of 32 people randomized. 11 got galantamine, 9 got methylphenidate, 12 got placebo, and we followed them. This is a multi-site randomized controlled trial. Just to kind of jump to the punchline, our 2 main outcomes were change in PTSD symptoms and change in post-concussive symptoms. This is a little hard to see. Placebo's in blue, galantamine's in red, and methylphenidate's in green. So this is at baseline, week 4, week 8, week 12. These are post-traumatic stress symptoms on the PCL-17, these are DSM-4 criteria. You can see over time not a whole lot happens with either placebo or galantamine. Methylphenidate group had this early and sustained reduction in PTSD symptoms. Even more surprisingly, I think, when we looked at the post-concussive symptoms, really nothing has been shown to move post-concussive symptoms in randomized controlled trials. And again, it's a small study. So this is a standardized measure, the River-Mead Post-Concussive Questionnaire. Not much happening with either placebo or galantamine, but look what happens with the post-concussive symptoms. So we were encouraged by this, also frustrated by the fact that we couldn't have done a larger trial, and have been trying for some time actually to obtain funding to try and replicate this and look at it in a bigger sample. We think we probably, there's a possibility we may have that funding lined up to be able to do that. But very exciting in terms of both for PTSD and for post-concussive symptoms, seeing this kind of change. So just to kind of sum up, I hope that I've raised a lot of questions in your minds, you know, that if you have been thinking about PTSD in a particular framework, and if you've been thinking about post-concussive symptoms, if you've been thinking about them at all, that's great. If you haven't, I hope you start doing that now with your patients and inquiring more about, you know, what sorts of concussions they may have had and how that relates to mental disorders that they may or may not have. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a consequence of exposure to emotionally traumatic events. That's the way we think about it. That's the way it's defined. Post-concussive symptoms are a consequence of exposure to concussive forces to the brain. That's the way we think about it. That's the way it's defined. But they frequently co-occur after traumatic injury. And having one increases the likelihood of having the other. Having one increases the likelihood of non-recovery from the other. They share risk factors, at least you know, epidemiologically, genetically. I don't know. We're going to look at that more closely. So could this be a substratum, a slice of PTSD that represents a distinct disease that's different from other types of PTSD? Does it have a predictable trajectory? Does it have a predictable response to treatment? Are there going to be certain treatments, psychological, pharmacological devices, whatever, where this group of individuals is going to respond better than to other treatments and maybe better than other groups of people with other types of PTSD? If there is inflammation involved as part of the process, and I think there's a lot of work yet to be done to answer whether or not that's the case, chances are that the inflammation could be something that's happening early on and then is kind of spiraling out of control, not being constrained, that could be a very early intervention target. Whereas later on, if we're looking at people who've had the problems for years, likelihood is that the inflammation isn't still ongoing, isn't still rearing along, but it's done damage. And then maybe there we need to look at ways to enhance executive function, which is how we think methylphenidate, how we're hypothesizing methylphenidate works in treating PTSD. Maybe that would be a particularly good treatment for those individuals. I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention and see if we have time for questions.